Welcome to Lento English. Ready to level up your English? Here we learn through stories, slow, clear, and fun. Listen, relax, and enjoy the journey.
1. Introduction. The country was deeply divided. People had very different ideas about how the nation should work. During President Trump's second term, these differences became more noticeable. Many citizens felt strong emotions about the country's direction. This created a sense of separation and disagreement among communities. In several major cities, large protests began. People gathered in the streets to show unhappiness with federal government decisions. These demonstrations were often loud and attracted many participants. The protests continued for weeks, sometimes months. They showed that many people wanted change and felt their voices were not heard. The federal government, led by President Trump, had a clear view. They believed the demonstrations were too large and caused disorder. The president and his advisors wanted a strong response to bring back control and ensure public safety. They saw the protests as a challenge to the rule of law. However, local leaders in the cities and states often disagreed. Mayors and governors believed people had the right to protest peacefully. They wanted to manage the situation calmly and avoid too much force. This difference created conflict between the federal government and local authorities. The federal government believed local leaders were not doing enough. Local leaders believed the federal government should not interfere. Amidst this tension, President Trump considered a serious plan. This plan involved using a very old law. This law gave the president special power to send the military to help with law enforcement inside the United States. It was a power not used often in history. The idea of soldiers in American cities caused great concern. Talking about this old law created more fear and anger. Some supported the president's idea, saying it was necessary to restore order. Others strongly opposed it, saying it would take away rights and make things worse. The whole country felt this tension. Everyone waited to see if the president would use this powerful law. This story is about this difficult time. It is a lesson about the challenges a nation faces when its people are divided. It explores the conflict between different levels of government and choices made during crisis. It shows the impact of decisions when power, order, and freedom are at stake. It helps us understand a complex period in the country's recent history. 2. A big problem. The city of Portland became a main point of the national problem. Many people gathered in the streets there. These large protests were against some federal government policies. Day after day, groups of people walked and stood together. They showed their disagreement with new rules. The protests grew bigger. They filled downtown areas and sometimes lasted late into the night. Local leaders in Portland worked hard. The mayor and other city officials wanted to keep everyone safe. They tried to manage the large crowds peacefully. They talked about solutions with the state government. The governor also wanted to avoid more trouble. Both local and state officials hoped to calm the situation. They believed local police could handle the events. They did not want outside help, but far away in the White House, the president and his team watched closely. They saw the events in Portland differently. The president used strong words. He called the protests a dangerous uprising. He said they were like an insurrection against the government. He believed these actions were criminal. One of his main helpers, Stephen Miller, also spoke about Portland. He said people were trying to stop the federal government from doing its job. This job included enforcing immigration laws. Miller called efforts to block federal actions a legal insurrection. He said it was an attempt to weaken the government's power. The White House saw the situation as a serious challenge to the country's authority. The president stated his thoughts clearly. He said that if people were getting hurt, or if courts, governors, or mayors tried to stop federal actions, he would act. He spoke about using a special law. This law would allow him to send United States troops into cities. He said he would do this if he thought it was necessary to make the city safe. He had also called some protesters domestic terrorists. The president made it clear he was ready to use this power. He believed the federal government had to enforce its laws. He felt the situation in Portland was a big problem. It needed a strong answer. The disagreement between the city, the state, and the federal government was now very large. It showed a deep split in the nation. The future of Portland and maybe other cities was uncertain. 3. The president speaks. President Trump appeared on national television. He also used social media to speak to the country. He said that the protests were too big and dangerous. He called them a serious threat to law and order. The president used strong words. He often called the protests criminal insurrection. He stated that some groups were trying to stop the federal government from doing its important job. He promised to make cities safe again. His message was clear. Peaceful talks were ending. His top advisors agreed with him. They said the federal government needed to act strongly and quickly. One important advisor, Stephen Miller, spoke about the situation often. He said that some people were actively trying to stop federal laws. He even called it legal insurrection when local leaders did not want federal help. He argued that the federal government must enforce its laws everywhere. He believed the president had a duty to protect federal authority. President Trump told reporters that he had a powerful plan ready. He said he might use a special power. This power would let him send U.S. troops to cities with trouble. He mentioned an old law called the Insurrection Act. He said this law was put in place for a good reason. He explained that if people were getting hurt, or if courts or local governors were stopping federal action, he would use it. He made it very clear that he, as president, had the final say. The president and his team believed that the protests were not just local problems. They saw them as a direct challenge to the federal government's power. They felt that the federal government had a clear right and a duty to step in. Because of this, they began to talk openly about using the military inside the country. This was a very serious step. It meant that trained soldiers could soon be sent to American cities. The discussions about using the Insurrection Act quickly became public. News channels reported on it. People across the nation heard these powerful words. Many citizens wondered what this old law truly meant. They also wondered if President Trump would truly send federal troops. The president's strong words and the open talk of military action made the situation very tense. Everyone waited anxiously to see what would happen next. The president's message was firm. He would use all his power to restore order. His advisors stood strongly behind him, ready for a decisive federal response. 4. The law is old. the president was thinking about a very old law. This law is called the Insurrection Act. It first became a law in 1792, a long time ago. It was changed a little in 1871, but it is still a law from a different time. Usually, the military cannot act as police inside the United States. This rule comes from another law called the Posse Comitatus Act, passed in 1878. But the Insurrection Act is an exception to this rule. It gives the president special power. This power allows the president to use the country's military forces inside the United States to help enforce laws. This can happen in certain difficult situations. There are two main ways the Insurrection Act can be used. One way is if a state's governor or its lawmakers ask for help. For example, this happened in 1992. There were big riots in Los Angeles, California. The governor of California, Pete Wilson, asked President George H.W. Bush for military help. The president then sent soldiers to the city. The other way is if the president decides it is necessary. The law says the president can use the military if unlawful groups or a rebellion make it impossible to enforce federal laws in a state. In this case, the president does not need the governor's permission. The president can act alone to make sure federal laws are followed or to stop the rebellion. Some presidents have used this power even when state leaders did not want them to. During the 1950s and 1960s, schools in the United States were being desegregated. This meant black and white students could go to school together. But some state governors did not want this to happen. Presidents Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy used the Insurrection Act to make sure federal desegregation laws were followed. President Eisenhower sent soldiers to Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957. He did this to allow 9 black students to enter a high school. The soldiers made sure the students were safe. These historical moments show how powerful this old law can be. It gives the president a strong tool in times of great trouble. 5. A hard choice. The governor of the state and the mayor of Portland spoke to the public. They said they did not want federal troops in their city. They believed that sending soldiers would make the situation much worse. It would also go against their power as local leaders. They felt it was their job to manage the city, not the federal government's. They argued that local police and state guard units were enough to handle the protests. Bringing in outside forces, they warned, would only escalate the tension. They worked hard to talk with the White House. They hoped to find a way to stop the federal government from sending in troops. These talks were difficult. The federal government had a different idea about what was happening in Portland. President Trump and his advisors often used strong words like insurrection to describe the protests. They felt the local leaders were not doing enough to stop what they called unlawful obstructions. The president himself said he would act if governors or mayors were holding us up. The governor and mayor also tried to calm the city. They asked people to protest peacefully. They wanted to show that Portland could manage its own problems. They believed that bringing in federal forces would only cause more anger and division among the residents. They knew that many citizens felt strongly about their right to protest. They tried to balance these rights with the need for public safety. The disagreement between the state and federal government became very clear. The state leaders said they had the right to decide what happened in their city. They pointed to the importance of local control and the unique needs of their community. The federal government, however, said it had the right to enforce national laws. They believed that some actions in Portland were against federal authority and needed a strong response. An aide to the president even called local efforts to block federal actions legal insurrection, showing the deep divide in viewpoints. The leaders in Portland faced a very hard choice. They had to protect their city and their citizens. They also had to deal with the increasing pressure from Washington, D.C. They did not want to lose control of their streets or their authority. But the federal government seemed ready to act, even if local leaders did not agree. The possibility of federal troops arriving made many people in Portland worried. The conflict over who had power, the state or the nation, grew stronger every day. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. This was a time of great tension and uncertainty for the city and for the country. 6. The troops arrive. President Trump made a very important announcement. He used a special power from an old law. This law was called the Insurrection Act. He said it was necessary because federal laws were not being followed. He spoke about the ongoing protests in Portland. He believed these events were a challenge to the government's authority. He stated that the normal ways of law enforcement were not working well enough. So, President Trump gave a direct order. He told federal troops to go to Portland. This decision was made without the agreement of the state's governor. The governor and the mayor of Portland had already said they did not want federal soldiers in their city. They believed it would make things worse. But President Trump used his authority. He sent the soldiers anyway to enforce federal law in the city. Soon after the order, the troops arrived. Large military vehicles like trucks began to drive into Portland. Soldiers in their uniforms were inside these vehicles. They came out and walked onto the city streets. They carried their equipment. For the people of Portland, seeing these soldiers was a new and surprising sight. It was a clear sign that a big change had come. News of the soldiers' arrival spread very quickly. Television channels showed live pictures of the troops in Portland. News reports and photos were everywhere online. People across the United States watched these events unfold. Many people in other countries also saw the news. The whole world was watching what was happening in this American city. Many felt a sense of shock. This was a very unusual event. For the residents living in Portland, the feeling was strong. They saw armed soldiers walking in their neighborhoods. Some people felt scared. They worried about what might happen next. Others felt very angry. They did not want the soldiers there and believed it was wrong for them to be present. The atmosphere in the city changed quickly. A feeling of worry and tension filled the air. President Trump said that his action was needed. He stated that it was to bring back law and order. He wanted to make sure that federal laws were obeyed by everyone. He believed that some groups were causing trouble and that stronger action was required. But the presence of soldiers on the streets changed everything for the city. It marked the start of a new and difficult time for Portland and the nation. 7. A city in two. Life in Portland changed quickly and completely. The familiar city streets now held a new and unexpected sight: federal soldiers. Their strong presence made daily life feel very different for everyone. Many residents felt a mix of worry and anger. Businesses found it hard to stay open, with fewer customers walking by. People sometimes avoided certain areas of the city where soldiers were most visible. The large protests, which had been a common sight for many weeks, continued. However, the interactions between the protesters and the federal troops were often difficult. There were regular clashes. These events sometimes included loud arguments, pushing, and small physical fights in the streets. Sometimes people received injuries, and many were arrested by the soldiers. The city felt deeply divided, as if there were two different sides standing against each other on the same streets. This new situation caused much tension and uncertainty every day. Because of the president's action, legal challenges began immediately. Lawyers worked quickly to file lawsuits against the decision to send troops. These important cases went to the federal courts. The lawyers argued that the president had used his power in a way that was not right. They said he did not have the authority to send soldiers into a state without the governor's direct permission. This started a significant legal battle watched nationwide. The courts faced the difficult task of deciding on the limits of the president's power under the old Insurrection Act. They also had to decide how much power state governments had in these situations. This was a crucial question for the entire country's legal system. The outcome of these court cases would set an important example for the future. The whole nation watched Portland very closely. People everywhere wondered what the final outcome of this difficult situation would be. They saw the images and videos of soldiers on city streets, and they heard the news reports. Many citizens discussed whether this use of federal power was fair or necessary. They talked about what it could mean for the future of their country. Would other cities also see federal troops arrive if their local leaders disagreed with the president's policies? What would this new approach mean for the important relationship between the federal government and state governments? The legal fight happening in the courts was seen as a way to find answers to these big questions. Everyone waited to see how the judges would rule on such an important matter. The situation in Portland became a big test for the country's laws and its ideas of liberty. It showed a deep split across the nation, highlighting a city struggling to be one, yet pulled in two different directions. 8. What we learn. The events in Portland served as a powerful lesson for the nation. They showed how an old law, the Insurrection Act, could be used in a modern time. This law, first made in 1792 and last changed in 1871, allows the president to use the military inside the United States. This power is usually limited by the Posse Comitatus Act from 1878, which stops soldiers from acting as police. Portland brought these two laws into sharp focus. Using the Insurrection Act raised many questions about federal power and state rights. Historically, it has been used in different ways. Sometimes, a state asks for federal help, as when California's governor asked President Bush for assistance during the Los Angeles riots in 1992. This was a clear request. However, in Portland, state and city leaders did not want federal troops. They believed it would make things worse. This difference highlighted a key part of the law. A president can also use the act when unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States make it impossible to enforce federal laws. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy used this. They sent troops to states to ensure schools integrated, even when state governors did not agree. This showed the president could enforce federal authority against local wishes. The arrival of federal soldiers in Portland without local consent created a deep divide. It made people think about the relationship between the federal government and the states. It also showed how leaders could see the same events very differently. Some saw a necessary step for order, others, an overreach of power harming local self-governance. Portland became a symbol of this larger struggle for power. This difficult time taught lessons about balancing security and liberty. It asked us to consider what it means to protect a nation while also protecting its people's freedoms. When is it right for the federal government to use such strong powers? What happens when a community's own leaders lose control to national forces? The story ends with important questions for the country's future. What is the proper role of the military in civilian life? How much authority should a president have in times of unrest? How can federal and state governments work together, even when they disagree? These questions are not easy, but they are vital for understanding how a society can maintain both safety and freedom for all citizens.